Welcome to Climate Courage. My name's Andrea Edwards.
Welcome and happy Valentine's Day from David.
And the same from me at the far end as usual, Richard Bassolato. Happy Valentine's Day.
Yep.
Oh, you romantics. Do you celebrate it?
I think I need to rush out straight after this to get something for my wife.
I will actually take her for lunch, but that's the extent of our celebrations. I think it's a working day, it's not a red day in the calendar. So
yeah, she's working today, so I can't take her for lunch. It's a good idea. How about you, Andrea? What are your plans?
I from day one, I said to my husband, we never do Valentine's Day. I'm not a believer in commercial celebrations, and nothing's changed. But I got the best Valentine's Day present today. My son came home after his first 2 weeks of national service, so he's got a shaved head. He's looking very tanned and buff, and it's really great. He's just here until Sunday morning, but we're going to make the most of it because my other son, it was his 17th birthday yesterday, so we'll be celebrating that for the weekend. So I think that's a good Valentine's Day.
It's a proper Valentine's present, right?
Yes. So how long is he back for?
So he's just back till Sunday. So it's a 2-year commitment. It's in the Singapore National Service. Unbelievably well organised. I'm so impressed. He started off pretty grim, but he's just got his head down, getting to work, just getting on with it. So, I'm really proud of him. It's good. Mindset's everything.
Yeah, I think that's a great recommendation for us today. Get our heads down, just get our mindset right and just go on through. I think that's what Climate Courage is about. So,
yeah. Don't stick your head in the sand.
No, don't. We've had a bit of a break, which is important because you've got to take care of yourself doing this sort of stuff too. David, what have you been up to?
Very interesting question, and I'd like to say a lot, and in some ways it has. I'm at the point of finishing a second book, and this is really going to be about what we need to do from a perspective of what we're seeing today, really, which is that the existing approaches are not really delivering. And also not just that, but climate change has entered into a different phase. I think of this as like, there was a phony war. We fight this thing against climate change and nothing seems to particularly happen. And now, I think as, Andrea mentioned, the climate risk index has shown that, there have been lots of things happening. And year started with the most amazing, kind of incredibly frightening wildfires over in California. And I think this book is really about how do we reconcile our money, our activities, our own attitudes and thoughts together in facing what goes on. And in short, what it comes down to is we can't rely on governments to do everything for us. We need to build that social capital that allows us to be able to move forward.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to talking about that more. And Richard?
Yeah, I just recharging the batteries, to 2 kids like you, both of them far away. They came back for Christmas, albeit briefly, but it's awfully nice to have them back, even if it's, in a parent's view, it's all too short. And personally, like David, thinking a lot about preparedness and what it will mean. And I think we are here debating what to do actually with the garden to some extent, because I'm looking out now as we speak and it's still absolutely waterlogged. That it puts a little bit of pressure on what you can grow there. But I'm sort of every year I've been experimenting with new crops, and I have a fairly sizable greenhouse that's used to the max. But now I'm thinking maybe I should branch out outside the usual vegetable patch with a few sort of green projects. But the water, I live in a place called Claygate. And as my builder once said, it's called Claygate for a reason. There is a lot of water retention in that soil. So it limits really what you can plant. You cannot plant anything subsoil. You need to go above. And that kind of limits you in some extent. But I'm looking out here and I have some ideas. And it's all about preparedness, for a better word, because it's not going to get easier. I'm sure we'll have a wetter winter next year and probably a drier summer as well.
Yeah. What do you know what the predictions are? I thought it was going to be more water for the UK. No.
That's what they say overall, but given what the pattern has been the last decade or so, it doesn't come when you want it. It comes in huge quantities, particularly during the winter half. And it's much more erratic in the summer. But when it rains in the summer, it rains very heavily. So it's getting almost like more tropical in that sense. It really has changed during the 28 and a half years I've been living here. I can notice how that weather pattern has changed.
Yeah.
Well, I think, the basic thing about the temperature being 1.4, is on the year, it was over 1.5 last year, right? Over the industrial days.
1.6.
Yeah.
1.6 we reached is that there is more moisture in the air. So you're going to get out in the morning, it's going to feel more moist. But what the other side that's been experienced is that it dries very quickly. When it dries very quickly. So what happens, you get this massive growth, and you see it in your garden. I'm sure that, when the sun comes around certain parts of the year along, then, you got more plants, they're more active, and they suck all the water out, and then it just dries really quickly. So you get the extremes going on. Be careful of sparks and things like that, because at the wrong part of the year, you're going to get fires.
Yeah.
I think, but coming back, I think the big picture for me, and if that's okay to move forward in this, is really about, the big question. What's really going on? Heard a lot of noise about Trump. First thing he did, pop back out of Paris Agreement. Is this important to us? Is this not? Second thing he did, kind of like tariffs on everyone. What does that really mean? And I think you have to remember one thing, and which is that the richest country in the world is saying it can't afford to run its government. That's why, this Dodge thing is floating around and all the rest of it. When you look at the numbers, the US government spends about 6.8 trillion, I think, a year. And it receives about, 4.9 trillion, 5 trillion. So there's a gap of about 1.8 trillion. That's bigger than, the GDP of most countries in the world. And that gap needs to be constantly financed by borrowing more, and interest rates are going up. And the more it borrows, the more those interest rates are going to go up. And more importantly, the more climate change starts impacting everything and puts prices up, the more those interest rates are going to have to stay high. So from that side, you're now in a situation where you're paddling like mad to try and keep yourself afloat. And if you stop, the debt is going to roll you over the cliff or over the waterfall, whatever it is. That's the right metaphor of that. And that's what's going on. I think that's the first part of what's going on. Richest country in the world cannot afford to run its governments. What happens to everyone else? What does that do for your climate preparedness?
Right. Richard?
Yeah, I think what David eminently is summing up is the harsh reality of 2025. It's not really a focus of debate other than the odd hotspot on the news that interest rates have gone up and the chancellor here in the UK might have to present a new budget. But the stark truth is that even before climate change really starts hurting us financially, because that's going to be the first transmission mechanism, the government has no buffers to help you, because government money is basically, it's finished. That levels in the developed world with a few exceptions. But in the large countries, certainly, they are at levels where there isn't any buffers. There's no spare capacity for a government to say, oh, gee, we had a flood here. We need to help these people, and you're going to write a blank check and make sure they can rebuild their lives elsewhere. That money isn't there anymore because it's already been used up. And sure, COVID didn't help, but it's not like COVID came out of the blue. It was always a possibility you would have some form of pandemic given the amount of travel and what we're doing to our planet. So to me, this is really showing off the position we are in. And it means everyone, everywhere in the world, you need to start thinking about what you can do for yourself, because whatever you had in mind in terms of assistant is simply not going to be able to come to you if bad things happen.
And it's really important to think of that in terms of yourself, your own, family group, your community, and even, your business and your local government in that way, because that money from the overall kind of distribution of wealth that goes around, that channel is fading. So instead of looking to money, it's going to be looking to, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of social capital, this idea that when I trip over, someone's going to be there to help me. And the most important part of that someone's going to be to help me is, do I actually worry about who might come to help me? Or actually, am I sufficient in kind of like a sufficiently well-mingled kind of community where anybody coming to help me, I'm going to welcome it?
No. All right. So I want to, so I'm not, this isn't my area of expertise. I'm just a human being trying to make sense of it. And, since Reagan and Thatcher, the whole concept of shrinking the government, right? We know that. To me, when I look at what we need to do to prepare in all ways for the climate, we need much, much more government, to take care of big infrastructure like dams and roads and, all the big stuff, So we either just unravel with the existing model, or we turn around and have a new model, which, is that what Doge is doing? Or, because to me it doesn't feel that way.
No.
Or do we need to be just the whole flip? Everyone's sort of talking about how the Democrats in the US and other sort of left-leaning governments around the world need to get a lot more radical in the way they're thinking, the Bernie Sanders sort of type approach. But taxation, of the mega wealthy to pay for all of these things. If artificial intelligence does what it's going to do, there's a lot more people going to be out of jobs. What are we going to do then? Do those companies get to make the first trillionaires in the world, or because they don't have as much human capital, do they start paying a much larger percentage towards society so that societies don't fall apart? Or do we just forget those people that lose out, and which could be any one of us, right? Mm-hmm. So is it about a flip in a model? Well, let's look at what they're doing over in the US, and then what are the other options?
Well, it is about a flipping of the model, but there are more models to flip to than what the Department of Government Efficiency is doing. So I think that's really important to recognize. So the flipping of the model is because, as Richard and I were saying earlier, governments are simply running out of money. They're borrowing so much, and they cannot continue to borrow in that way. They're going to try, and they're going to carry on borrowing in that way. And what we're going to find is that the IMF is going to fail to be able to lend. And they've been supporting many of the countries which have been having issues just buying fuel and food and so on. And I'm pretty sure, I think they increased this call for contributions last year by, I've gotten the right number, something like 50% or so. And it's going to be a situation where they're going to be able to fail to continue to lend in that way. And that's a critical piece of that connection between governments, as it were. The flipping of the coin is to stop thinking so much in terms of the money in that way, but the interaction between people that you want and the participation you want. So the current model is very much, as Richard and I were talking before, about how we build and build and build in order to try and keep growth up and continue in that way. Climate change is going to force it on all of us. That's the most important thing. You can try and build, but you're going to find you're going to run out of money along the way. So it changes the idea of how you build. What's the first piece I put down so that that's actually useful for me to make some revenues out of it? What's the next piece to put down so that continues it and extends it and so on, rather than thinking I can just go straight in a linear fashion and eventually I get there and then I have my whole bridge. But that's not really going to work anymore. So those are the sort of models that we want. More social capital, in other words, more interaction between people, between communities, between different countries at a level where it's actually about the interaction. Even if you don't agree a deal as you go along, the fact that you've talked to each other is relevant. That's kind of what it means. In the existing model, is the fact that if you don't agree a deal, then everything is a failure. That's not the case. And that's why it's not the approach that kind of Elon Musk and his mate Donald Trump. By the way, it is in that order: is Elon Musk and his mate Donald Trump. I think, don't get fooled by it. The bros are there; they're in charge, and thinking in those terms. So stay focused about what you think is most important for you. And in that model, I think. You take a look today, about 80% of the world's solar panels come from China, and they're very happy to sell it cheap. They're willing to take one for the team, as it were, then buy them. And just because the US put tariffs on things from everyone else, it means everyone else can trade with each other that a little bit cheaper. And as Napoleon said, if your enemy is making a mistake, don't interrupt. So the US is on a way of kind of imploding. That's very unfortunate for my friends who live in America. But from the rest of the world perspective, there's no need for the rest of the world to go and shrink itself just because the US wants to shrink itself.
Food for thought, indeed. My position in economic terms is somewhere between extreme liberalism and extreme libertarian connected. And I think if you look back through history, and I can't think of one serious economist who would disagree with me on this point, is basically you build prosperity by free trade and free migration. All great economic powers through history has managed to do so because you were able to use those resources relatively freely. Now what we're seeing is definitely a big change towards migration, which in economic terms, I cannot actually explain why people are against someone coming. It's a fantastic resource. Make sure you use it properly. Free trade is largely about protecting special interests, and those special interests connects back to who actually controls government. From a macro global perspective, tariffs are idiotic. All it does is basically lower economic output on a global level. While you might have one single industry in one single place that actually benefits from being protected, the world at large loses out. And it feels like the current US administration has embarked on a policy which, in my mind, is very small-minded. And I think David puts this a lot better than I do. When it's basically about keeping US first, not making US great again. It's about we need to stay ahead because we can see all these threats to our economic supremacy, largely from China, but also the whole other myriad of countries that are actually shrinking the economic gap to the US. India, large parts of Asia, Europe, if they ever decided to get their act together, but I seriously doubt that. And he wants to keep US first, ahead of everyone else, even if it means that everyone in this field is worse off. That's the trade-off he's decided to do on a macroeconomic level. To me, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever, because I'm all for maximizing the total pie, and then we can sit down and have a discussion about how we're going to distribute it. And that, on the other end, in terms of distribution, I don't think taxation works to help what's going on in the world, because tax bases are so fleeting, and the change we need, there just isn't enough money to tax people out of, because the cost is so much larger if you're going to tackle climate change in a centralized way. So I think you start at the other end and you say, what is an acceptable tax rate for people to pay globally? And I tend to gravitate around 30%, maybe 35%. What do I know? And once you conclude that you should pay, irrespective whether you make a lot or quite a lot, and if you make nothing, you should have a free pass on taxation. Taxation should kick in only if you start earning a reasonable amount, working full time, basically. Then we need to have a serious discussion globally on how that money is spent, because it's such a finite pot. How can we put this money to great use? We need education, we need healthcare, and we need some form of legal system that actually operates. But at the moment, I cannot watch the news, whether I'm in Sweden, whether I'm here, whether I'm in France, and every news program contains some story about people thinking they're. And to me, that's just, the demands on government are coming from all angles to provide more money when there is none. Let's maximize the pie by making sure that we can grow the economic pot in a sustainable way, or like David likes to say, nature's pace, without stealing from the future and without doing idiotic choices that actually makes this pie and pot smaller. And then we sit down and we have a serious discussion. How are we going to distribute this? What are the priorities for state to provide to its citizen? And in my humble opinion, it will be a lot less than there is now. So let's focus on the important issues, because the money isn't there.
We've got Genevieve here. She's popping up, but when I scroll, I can see her comment and then it disappears. So I don't know if you guys know who Genevieve is. Genevieve W. But she's sort of saying, I think we all agree with her. It will cost trillions to make our cities climate resilient to the rapidly changing climate. 2% is roughly prepared for what is coming. 2% sounds generous.
Yes, but he could be right. I think I actually think that ballpark is probably in the ballpark correct.
No, I think first of all, I feel what Richard is saying is how we want the world to be. The reality is the world is not like that.
No.
And climate change means that the time for those things are kind of gone. Because within the discussions we learn from, and I see sort of people talk about, the model United Nations and those sort of things, right? That's kind of like, you are 18-year-old or 17-year-old. You learn about these things so that by the time you get to 30 or 40, you'll be able to implement them. By the time you get to 30 or 40, the world will be completely different. And the politics is flipping around as a result of the fact that the money isn't there. And the money isn't there not because there isn't a notional amount of money, but because all the spare capacity is constantly being used up in order to keep this economy paddling. Essentially, that's what's going on. Every time you turn on and someone talks about we have to increase productivity, that's what it means. It means that extra dollar that has just landed into your government is now going to be used in some ways to keep this thing paddling, constantly growing along in that way. So when you take something out of the box, like climate change, and say, we got to somehow deal with that, what you're going to find is governments are not going to be the place. And if you look at trying to transfer, the billionaires have $14 trillion in total between them. That's according to Forbes. The world has $150 trillion of global assets. As a kind of conservative estimate, there is going to be about 60 trillion of generational transfers. And the mass affluent, which is basically people like you and I here, and those people who, and mass affluent to me is anyone who can afford to save, basically. So the mass affluent has about $90+ trillion. So that money has to come from those people, has to come from our own decisions about where and who we spend our money with to make the world better. That's how it's going to go. And if those people and those things we want to make the world better are not going to be there, we need to actually go and innovate and get people to innovate to make those things present. And that's what it is. Because once it lands into the government, what happens is they go and build a new airport with it. And that's what happens. And then you look at that and you think, I don't want a new airport. What's the point of having a new airport if no one can afford to fly? And that's what happens, is because governments have this playbook that they're picked up from a time before climate change. That's where they learned their politics from. Nobody has a playbook for what's coming forward because it's never happened. And so the money that you talk of and the governance that we want has to come from our own interaction with each other. And the great thing about today is like where we are here. Andrea's in Singapore. I'm hoping that people will be listening to us around that kind of time zone, someone early in the UK and around in Europe. And so we can actually have that democratization of knowledge. And taking back that democratization of knowledge and placing it properly into the hands of individual people, individual businesses, individual communities is the best gift we can make. And taking it back in the sense of it's all out there, that we've given it to these tech bros and they're using it in order to try and be more efficient, more productive for them. And that's not actually enhancing the interactions between people, the genuine interaction that builds a social capital. So that's when, for me, it needs to come from. The biggest issue is this climate change, which we're entering into a very active phase. So we need to be practicing our drills mentally. Those drills is, where's my money? What's going to happen to it if the stock exchange shuts down for a week or longer? Because it won't just sit there safely as if you imagine it will be in your bank or in your mattress. Where am I located? What's my job about? Am I actually doing the thing that gets me up in the morning and feel great about doing? If not, what is that? And how do I actually think about blending them together? Because that's going to give you that mental fortitude to keep going forward. And that's really important because, that mental state, that mental well-being is really important together with physical. I keep hurting my back and my physical well-being is all messed up. But I think my mental fortitude is pretty good. So that helps me go forward.
All right. So basically what I'm hearing from both of you is Trump irrelevant is based on the fact that we've just gotten to the point where we've taken too much from nature. We're now so much in debt to nature that there is no ability to move forward where we can rely on finance because we've already taken too much. And so therefore the only thing we can do is sort of huddle together as society. So like when you look at it from a global perspective, right? Singapore takes care of its nation. It takes care of its people. I was in Thailand during the pandemic. And when I was in Singapore, I was getting a mani-pedi. And whether they were Singaporean or not, they got a salary from the Singapore government to get them through. I was talking to the ladies of the night in Thailand. Nobody was taking care of them. Nobody helped them get them through, right? Very, very different. So Singapore as a nation, it takes care of its people. Some countries, China takes care of its people. Its whole system is really interesting. But in Asia, it tends to be a little bit more, if they've got the money, they'll do the right thing and get people through as much as they can. Whereas in Europe, tends to be a little bit more when it's down, everyone sort of scrambles for themselves. Is that a correct interpretation?
No, I think the difference, I think it's a really good way of approaching it, what you're describing. So you have over in Asia where there is this sense of taking care of each other. And that's very prevalent. As you go into Europe, there's this sense very much that government takes care of me.
Right. And that's what's causing the problems at the moment with the right swing because of that. It's not because that needs not being met because it's more socialist sort of fundamentally, isn't it?
Exactly.
So that's what the rightward swing's all about, mainly from men and younger men, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And as you go over to America, it's each one for himself. I've got to take care of me because that's the model of the Wild West in that way. And so as you go along, what we need as a world going forward, because resources are scarce, climate change makes resources scarce. That's a basic thing. Is more of the Eastern model of taking care of each other across the world. And if Trump wants to go along and says, I'm only going to take care of me, I'm going to make sure America only takes care of me, that's great. You don't want to be in the pie, then pop out of it. We don't care. We'll take care of each other. You can shrink, but we don't have to shrink with you. Every tariff you put up is an opportunity for a trade between some other country. And this is the analysis I posted in LinkedIn before about the steel tariff, 25% steel tariff. Basically, the U.S. uses about 100 million tons of steel a year. The world consumes 1.9 billion tons. And the US imports 28 million tons. So if it doesn't want to do that, 28 million out of 1.8 billion ton of consumption, it spreads out very happily. It's no problem. You don't want any of it. It's your issue.
Here's a climate change impact when it comes to that as well. Right now, tonight, a Category 5 cyclone is going to hit the largest iron ore port in the world off the west coast of Australia. So that's kind of interesting. We've got a couple of comments here. So Gusta, if I said it correctly, what can we do on a personal level? And we will definitely get there. But we've got Jonathan, who's sort of saying time to step forward and fill the leadership void. And I absolutely agree that I think this is the time for new leadership to rise. We're looking at some of the Democrats. I mean, Bernie Sanders has always been out there, right? AOC is really speaking up and much more in the way that I think the Democrats haven't been able to speak up. But I think there's new leaders will rise. But
and I really want to pick that up. We had a conversation yesterday. I'm just finishing off a book about a mechanism to make money from the oil and gas and coal by keeping it in the ground. And we'll go and talk about that another time. But the point about the conversation yesterday was how can we actually make a series of events happen, say around the week before COP30, that totally takes the fact that the US is not going to show up into any relevance. And this is the part about taking leadership in control in that way. We don't have to have one leader. We can all be leading around. I have an example in my book about starling murmurations. If you see starlings, they are these little black birds that fly around. You see them in Northern Europe. They form these massive kind of squadrons of aerial display. And the point about that is there is no leader, but they sort of do these really graceful dances around. Everyone influences everyone else as they go along. And what you get is a fantastically graceful performance. And that's what happens actually in nature in that way. So as we come towards it, the idea is that how can we have a whole series of things that goes around, each person demonstrating what they and their presence can influence. It may be in arts, it may be in science, it may be in social kind of connections, it may be in thinking, and whichever it is, and just kind of hold this part that says, you know what, we've got this because we are connected. And we are facing it, and we are getting ourselves prepared. We're doing drills, our own climate drills, whatever that means, whether it's a business or whether it's a community or whether it's a family and an individual with my neighbor or otherwise. And that's how you go along and you fill this leadership gap, because you're not going to get it from thinking, is it going to be the leader of the AfD at the German election who's going to do this? Or if it's going to be the leader of some other party in some other country. Because what happens there is they are all running out of money and they can't hand out anymore. And that kind of politics is disappearing.
All right, so I want to go back to the money thing, because I think this is an area of the average person who has not done what you guys have done in your lives and your professions and your studies would just be sitting there going, the richest man in the world. Or BP recently announced that they're going to basically scale back their renewable energy because they've lost some money, but they've still made like $9.6 billion in profit. When you think of a country that's still got plenty of resources to extract and ship and sell around the world, it's Australia. They're also got a cost of living crisis that's really, really cutting deep, which could potentially look at getting the right-wing version of Australia, the Liberals back in power in an election when it's called this year, right? And of course, 70% of the media is dominated by Murdoch. So, there's not exactly a balanced sort of conversation going on over there. But there's, Gina Reinhardt, I'm sure she's still making a lot of money out of her business. There's a lot of wealth. So why can't we tax the wealth? And of course, this is, I think, a big part that people miss is people who say the greedy shareholders, often not recognizing that they could be one of those shareholders themselves because they've got a pension that's invested in that. So why can't the wealth, this massive accumulation of wealth that we're seeing all around the world, why can't that be tapped to address the challenges that we face?
I think the very simple reason that I think Richard might follow with that is that wealth is essentially in the assets. So when you tax it, what happens is people have to sell it. And what that's going to do is it's going to get a collapse of the assets. And then the debt comes in, because the debt is all, debt is one side of your balance sheet along, and your assets is the other. You go to your bank and you say, can I borrow so much? You're going to say, how much is your house worth? And if you tax the house, then you're going to have to sell the house. And then the next thing is everybody's house is collapsing price. So this is part of an unfortunate trap that we have all set ourselves and landed ourselves in.
Okay. Yeah, technically, David is spot on. It appears as if we have a lot of wealth, but our net wealth is actually frighteningly small because the debt is so large. And again, even if you were to be, brutally radical and you say we're going to confiscate all the wealth of everyone with a net value over X, it's just not going to be enough. It's a drop in the ocean. You can tax on the margin. Personally, I don't like tax because it doesn't work. That's the historical empirical evidence. You find one tax rate in the economy which people accept as fair, and then you don't get tax evasion, you don't get tax avoidance, because people accept this as a fair tax rate. And by the way, I think one of the greatest steps you could take is actually making that tax rate universal for regardless of what kind of income you have, because then you make a lot of lawyers unemployed that today basically are just juggling various income streams between various classes of income. Make it one tax rate, simple. This is what we pay towards our social systems. If it gets too large, capital flies and it gets obfuscated. But like David says, that capital is not really there in capital. It's mostly there in land, in houses, and a lot of equity market valuations. That if you start selling that, where would the price of NVIDIA go to if you had to sell out 30-40% of the holdings? It would collapse. And then the wealth is not there. So I cannot see taxation working as a mean to raise the capital that is even in the vicinity of what's needed. And therefore, we need a different approach to how we're going to solve this.
To add, there's a comment from Jonathan Frost and this thing. And I just had a quick look through, and I would say that one part of a financial transaction tax, I think that's a great idea. I think that we don't have enough of that in that way.
So you think the 1-2% that because there's a push for a global billionaires tax at 1 or 2%. Do you think
it's not going to work?
That's not going to work. That's okay. I mean, again, this is the difference between what you think you need to the time horizon that you think you need it, and what in the ideal world that you think you can get. And the difficulty between the two of them is that the physical world is changing. So when we hold these conversations, we have to think about the fact that actually next year, the conditions are going to be harder. There's going to be more headwind, the terrain is going to be rougher, we're going to be running uphill, and it's going to be muddy along with that. And the year after that, then there's going to be like quagmires and quicksands and swamps and whatever else that may be. So running into those things, you're not going to get people to come around and sit happily around each other, around, in the UN building and having that nice little discussions that goes on and trying to form agreements about it. Everybody is going to be keeping the cards close to the chest unless you can actually open up that model that you were describing between what happens in Singapore and the countries around there, and Malaysia, where the social connection is stronger. What happens in Europe? Europe's going to find itself in deep trouble. Well, Mr. Americas, everybody gets their guns out, which is actually not a solution at all. So within these, what you have as a difference is the distinction between tax and contributions. A financial transaction contribution, where you actually part of everything, a part of what you spend, goes into something that you believe in, or whatever it is, whatever that may be. At the level of what it is, Richard and I worked out, it takes something like 1 day's worth of the world's spending, of the top 2,000 companies spending, which is not the world's spending, just a fraction of it, just the top 2,000 spending, to be able to use and structure and buy out all the oil, gas, and coal companies in the world. Because if you're an owner, you have an income stream for it. I can replace that income stream by a fraction of the world's spending. I can then go along and say, who is with this? Which business wants to contribute together with it? 1 day's worth is 1/3% in that way. If you spend $10, what is that? That's like
cents. No, 3 cents.
3 cents.
Yeah.
On $10 in that way. And that's the sort of level where the contributions can come. The distinction between contributions and tax is that contributions allow you to have more control. Tax ends up into a pot, which ultimately goes into building another airport. That's the difference between a contribution and a tax. So if you want to have that transfer of wealth along, we have to ask ourselves, how much are we willing to transfer? Are we willing to transfer? And incidentally, the top 2,000 company, their revenues, $50 trillion. So that gives you a sense of scale of what's going on, and how much money goes around.
A lot of those top, what was it, 2,000 companies?
Yeah, Forbes 2000 index.
Yeah, right. A lot of them would be sitting in the category of they're as destructive towards the environment as the fossil fuel industries, not because they just rely on fossil fuels in their products, but obviously the chemicals, so the consumer goods companies. When you go into the supermarket and there's 100 shampoos for oily hair, 100 shampoos for dry hair, honestly, how many do we need? And to me, they're part of the problem too. That so it's not just, it's never, for me, it's never just been about the fossil fuel industry. It's about all industries and what needs to go. I mean, so one of the things is every time you fly, you pay more to fly. So the frequent flyer gets flipped, right? Every person on the planet has an entitlement to fly, and we work out what that looks like. And if you don't fly, the people who are flying, every time they fly, they pay more and more into a central pot, and it gets dispersed. It's kind of similar to your oil, keeping the oil in the ground sort of idea, and you sort of spread the wealth around. But yeah, I'm still not getting the essence of what this looks like in reality, just from I know how much we've got to do.
I think for me, this applies as much to the person as to the country. What is it that it means for the country, or for me as a person, to be thriving in that way? Because we need to ask this, because conditions and constraints around us are going to get harder, constraints are going to get tougher in that way along. And so we have to actually address this in thinking, I can't actually access all the resources I want just to do everything I want. So let me start back the other way. What is it that I actually want to do? How does it compare with what I actually do? So that goes down to your consumption sort of thing. What is it that I actually want to wear? What does that compare with what I actually buy? How many outfits do I actually wear versus how many do I try on? And those sort of questions are personal questions along. Having a contribution associated with the money you spend forces you to think about that a little bit more, because there is something that you're actually taking out of your pocket in that way. And again, we are entering into a world where there is the kind of state that this is in some ways, and I was talking with my daughter about this in a sense, is the world is being squeezed into something that's like, Germany in the 1930s, where conditions around are terrible. It needs to be paying out loads of things. And so what does it do? It then goes along and tries to print money as a way to resolve its problem. And that encourages the development of kind of, you get into inflationary era where you get inflation, and stagflation allows dangerous men to thrive in that way. And you don't want that. So you kind of somehow have to find that way to find your own space so you're not influenced by all the noise around you. Because otherwise, you're going to find yourself placed in the situation where you start thinking, well, I am in a Wild West town, so I really want that Wild West crazy guy because somehow he says he'll protect me. Maybe he will, but that's better than nothing at all. I think you just want to avoid landing into that spot. And therefore you have to prioritize how you're going to be prepared. There are too many issues to all be resolved. So what is it? That is your issue. How are you going to allow that to be the positive thing that you do, that you contribute to the people around you, so that they want to interact with you? Because the person that you piss off is the person you're going to rely on tomorrow.
Yeah.
No.
I think that's the whole essence of it. It is somewhat perplexing that we haven't learned more from history, because actually you have the playbook, for a better word, of how this is going to pan out. And grim economic times brings out thoughts and leadership that finds the fuel in the discontent of people who are feeling that they are owed, whether that's right or wrong. And obviously the closest we have on a large scale in history is sort of Germany, 1920s, 30s, and it didn't work out very well. Let's stop that particular discussion there. But it's not the only example. You can go through history in various contexts. And stagflation is a strong element of that, because ultimately the sort of monetarist in me tells me you cannot print money out of your problem. You can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And that means all you do when you print money is basically create a short-lived illusion of wealth, and then the harsh reality kicks in, because the money cannot create the resources you're craving at the price you want to pay for them. And that's where the world is. We're running out of resources. And the most pressing resource of all we have is the carbon budget. We cannot put money into a big coffer and say we want more carbon budget. That doesn't give us that. We cannot mine more gold just because we have more money to mine for, because the resources are not there. Those things are running out. Fresh water, we're running out of that. The aquifers are drying up. Even if we had the money, we cannot fill them up. So we need to flip that economic thinking around into start prioritizing. And it has to come from an individual level. Because at the top, you will have people telling you, I can fix this, without actually providing any details, because they can't. So individuals' own choices are what's going to effectively turn this around, by saying, I don't want to buy that product, but I want to buy that one. I want to spend my money doing this, not that. And things like flying.
I think sorry to interrupt, Richard.
No.
What you're saying there just reminds me, we've been playing this game called the Game of Thrive, and we devised it. It's a game that we take to corporates as an activity. And it's a game that illustrates all of these things in a very simple way. In the game, all the players are potato farmers. So the choice they have is to harvest the potato, to plant potato, harvest the potato or not. If they harvest the potato, then the next guy doesn't get any. If the guy before harvests the potato, then they didn't get any. So what do? And this feels like, oh, is it a prisoner's dilemma? But it's incredible, the richness of what happens comes along. We had a lady who comes along and harvested it and shared it all out. And she says, I come from a high context culture. for us, it's not just what you say, it's what you do. And that completely switched the pace of the game and the nature of the game. We had another game where Richard stole all my potatoes. And he says, you just got too rich. That's what happens when that happens. And that actually opened up everybody's voices in that way. And the thing about the game is about opening up your voice, knowing that you do have a voice and that actually you can say the things that actually trouble you. And this is the part where the social capital comes in, is where actually it's not about agreeing or disagreeing. It's actually about the interacting and connecting that comes from it. If you feel you can't say anything, or you create a situation where people can't say anything, then there is no connection and there is no richness and abundance within the society and the community that will allow the investments and the innovations to come. However it is, it's not the money that really drives it. And that's where we've given in to the tech bros, who says, oh, it's all about the money. You need $500 billion in order to build the next AI. And then DeepSeek comes along and says, we did it on $2. That's the point. And when people talk about why they did it on $2, it's because they talk to each other rather than silo their knowledge.
Food for thought, huh?
Play the game of Thrive, podcast is a great thing.
If anyone's sort of listening, and you feel like this, so my thing is, we have the global economy that we've got, right? We know what it's done. We know where we are, or people who are paying attention. Nate Hagen says this thing: we are the bend or we break. So, and I think that's a really great way of sort of saying it. We sort of bend towards change rather than waiting for it to basically just all crash. I think we're much closer to crashing than we've ever thought. Most people are even considering, but we don't seem to be able to have the conversation of, so moving beyond what you've just been talking about the individual, right? But moving on with that bigger conversation about capitalism, the economy, and where we're going. From everything I'm looking at, we need to completely turn it on its head, and it's going to be so disruptive. No matter what we do, it can't be a gentle landing, because we didn't gradually do it. But we're not even doing that. Like, I think of countries in Asia, right? Or even Australia. It's still digging up the stuff out of the ground and sending it overseas because it keeps the economy strong at home. But even though those people are actually making more money than they've ever made, the people in Australia are not flourishing as they should be. Where you look at somewhere like Norway, everyone talks about them as a great, clean, green country, but they're exporting massive amounts of fossil fuels overseas, right?
Sure.
But we're not even having the conversation of what that flip looks like. And it's going to be painful and it's going to hurt. And, like big agriculture, that's one of the things that really concerns me. An industry 100% reliant on the environment, right? How many people have invested in big agriculture? Is it part of their pension portfolio? It's massive, right? If you fly into a place like Bangalore, it's got this beautiful, rich orange earth. And as I was flying in, I was thinking, wow, this must be amazing for the farmers. And since the technology industry moved in, what's happened is they're building these towers and skyscrapers and buildings to house the tech sector. And guess who's been pushed out? The local farmers. Yeah. Well, if we're all going to rely on big agriculture, an industry reliant on the environment, at some point big ag's going to fall over. So it's going to be the financial losses from that and the catastrophic impact of that. Our farmers will be saying, well, you guys didn't care about us before, and they've moved on to other things. So where are we going to get our food from? And we're already facing extreme food shortages, droughts. I mean, chocolate's on the list, What do you guys think?
No, food shortages scares me a lot. And there are multiple reasons why we kind of ending up here. And you described, the crowding out. but we also are overusing our agriculture resources, and that really is big tech agriculture, huge fields, monocropping, GM, fertilizers and pesticides. They're all contributing to basically stealing from the future. And I read somewhere about the topsoil in the US that 70-80% of Midwestern topsoil is at the bottom of the Atlantic. And then I thought, how serious is that? That was before I started planting my own stuff. And then I realized topsoil is kind of quite essential. But if nature's going to replace topsoil, it takes about 500 years to get 1 inch. And there are places around the world where you lost 6, 7, 8 meters of topsoil, where you are in the most rich countries for growing agricultural products. That runs the risk of what you're describing as coming off a cliff. And water shortages will just accelerate that process. And, things like the bee population falling will pose enormous challenges going forward to just pollinate this crop. It is entirely possible. And here, it depends whether I wake up on the left side or the right side, and I'm on the fence here. Do you get change because you have catastrophic outcomes and the outcomes is not so catastrophic that you can't mend your ways and start moving forward? Or do you need to introduce that change gradually because before the catastrophic events happen, you can see your way, mend your ways? When I think of it, I tend to lean towards the former. It is entirely possible that it would be somewhat beneficial to have a not too catastrophic event taking place for us to start mending our ways in this way, in thinking this way. And I am quite upset that we haven't seized the moments that have presented themselves in the last couple of years to try to do so. And I think COVID was a phenomenal point in time because it affected everyone globally to basically refocus policies on what actually matters in the world instead of just distributing money and borrow from your children and grandchildren, because that's what we did. We said, the government will provide you with pay, instead of actually shaking people up and saying, ultimately, this is what happens when you run out of resources. Now we need to retool the whole thinking around the area. And I do think we will have a catastrophic event before we will really start mending our ways. That would be my baseline scenario.
I think the difference here, the economics I've been thinking about and espousing along is what I call an emergent economics. And that's an economics that's not directed, but is the consequence of people interacting themselves and coming along. It's a bit like, when do the monarch butterflies know how they start their migration south? They go from Northern California all the way and fly all the way down to Mexico in 1 generation. It takes 4 generations to come back. How do they know? Do they have WhatsApp? Do they sort of message each other in this massive monarch butterfly group and WhatsApp each other and say, tomorrow 2 o'clock we start flying? They don't do that, but they do go in this group. There are some pioneers who start earlier. There's some laggers who go late, and they are the odd ones who never take off, and they get themselves caught and trapped along with it. But it's an emergent behavior that responds to the changing environment around them, that gets them to go and move. So I think it's very important to realize that if we want our governments to do things, we ourselves have to be the leaders in the steps along that way. Because in the world where there is not enough money for governments, they can never be the leaders. They don't have the resources. They're constantly fighting a rearguard action. And that's where they end up doing silly things like, let's build a 3rd runway at the Heathrow Airport or whatever it goes on to. And so this emergent aspect then asks us to say, what steps can we take? What steps do we do? Australians are great because they've kind of like had all of these things, and they got their, wildfire go backs, and they've done their drills and stuff, and they're prepared. And the mentality is one where, the world is not going to give me the condition. What I would prefer But you know what? I'm going to find my way to thrive in the condition that it gives me, which allows you to see resources and opportunities in a different way. And that's really important. As to the state of the world, I was looking at the World Food Report, and the FAO publishes this. And the world's stock-to-use ratio in grains is 30%. Just think about that, 30%. Right? That's 4 months, basically. And then we run out if there is something that happens. The reason why it's so low is because the world economy thinks that actually as you go from one region of harvest to the next region of harvest to the next region of harvest, the harvest will be there. So you're okay. But what climate change does, and this comes out in our Game of Thrive as well, is that when it comes along, it hits everybody and you don't know who. So how do you interact? So when you roll along from one region harvest that has failed and you go to the next one, that might be fine. The one after that may not. Then what happens is you saw that in 22. Every country then holds back on their own exports. They ban it for their food. And now you got a problem because nobody can manage in that world. And this is where the model that you want to espouse and the interactions you want to demonstrate to each other. You know, you really did piss me off, but you know what? That's fine. I'll have another conversation with you because I'm going to need you tomorrow.
Yeah, rice was a big one.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, and what percentage of the world's population depend on rice as their primary source of food?
Yeah, a large part. I mean, in terms of grains, there are only two crops that matter: is rice and wheat. That's what feeds the world, right? And you grow one of the two depending on your conditions.
Yeah,
those are the two things that basically keeps us at bay from starvation. They're two crops,
and the stock-to-use ratio for them is both about 30%.
Yeah,
when that's not a good ratio. So for yourself, what does that mean? You know, be an urban farmer. That's one of the things you do. If you're then an urban farmer, that changes how you can interact with your neighbor because you've got spare tomato to give them.
Yeah.
And then they can go along. And then if you're in a situation where the weather conditions outside is terrible, the indoor conditions are the best controlled. So you can manage that. You can actually start thinking about what to do with grey water indoors. And you suddenly realize actually what for you're not trying to create enough to make yourself fully independent subsistence. This is not the survivalist. How do I build a bunker that I can live in for 10 years? This is having that margin of buffer so that you can actually interact better with the people around you. And if everybody has that little bit of margin of buffer, it makes a big difference. And on the flip side of that is also having that margin of capacity in terms of the energy that you have. You know, this is what I do in the morning. What are the things? And then thinking, do I have enough energy to do all of that? Do I need to save some energy for myself? You know, rather than 10 things, maybe I'll just do the 3. And then that changes your outlook on what it is that's important and what you need to do along. That applies for business as much as well. You know, we talk to some businesses about what they do, and it ends up being, how do you actually make use of what you already have in the way that builds out that robustness that you have, rather than thinking, do I need to go along and do that thing? Do I need to go along and do that thing? Because typically those things have high risk of not being able to complete because resources and money is getting scarce. Prices are going up.
Yeah. And I think what David's saying is fantastic because, you know, as you well know, I have a lot of bugbears, right? One of the ones that just doesn't compute in my brain is when we have the very much top-down decision making that says, oh, we're going to build X number of solar panels and we just do it because it's the right thing to do. We build wind towers. It's the right thing to do. But the process has never gone through to figure out whether that was actually in any way, shape, or form an optimum solution. And you go all in that this is what we're going to do. I think UK is committed to investing 50 billion pounds in carbon capture. It's a technology, and I'm not a scientist, as far as I can understand. It just doesn't work. This is the closest you get to a scam. And you're committing serious capital, because 50 billion pounds is a lot of the UK budget, to this kind of enterprise. Why don't you start small and see what happens? Because if you are wrong, the outcome is actually not catastrophic. It's just, that was bad, but you know what? We got a little bit hurt, we dust ourselves up and we go another day and we try something new. But the whole idea that solutions need to be huge and you take for granted that you're making the right decision is, to me, just idiotic. Because that's not actually how you run any form of business if it's your money you're putting at risk or it's your capital. And that's what governments are doing. They're trying to sell you the idea that we know what we need to do when we're going to go very big, and this is the path to the future. The reality is it doesn't work that way. It might, because only if you were lucky.
The whole conversation around the carbon capture technology is fascinating. Should we be developing the technology? Absolutely. Should countries like the UK be investing $50 billion in it right now? No. It keeps the fossil fuel industry alive.
Yeah,
it's worse than that. I mean, it does keep it alive. You know, if you look at UK's carbon capture group, is people like Annie and Technip, who are oil and gas people. And the reason is because they get subsidies for building it, they get subsidies for using it to extract oil and gas.
Yeah.
So it basically makes it free to extract oil and gas.
Yeah.
Essentially, when you go through the numbers and stuff, and the lunacy about it is that it is literally looking for a needle in a haystack, and more like looking for a needle in a barn full of haystack. That's what carbon capture means, because there are so few carbon molecules in the atmosphere. You have to suck in a whole load of stuff in order to find them in that way. And it
requires energy to do that, right?
And it requires energy to do that. So that energy is now no longer available to displace oil and gas and coal. And the fact about it is that it is far easier and far better not to release the carbon dioxide out there in the first place.
Yeah.
And that's the equation, because the blinkered way, you know, kind of the what do you call it? I can't quite remember, sort of like, you know, the one track vision that comes along, is that you end up being put on this rail track, and then you say how that step forward is a natural step forward from this rail track. And then you go along and you go, and then the next one is there, and you go through the tunnel and you come out the other end, and the other end's supposed to look nice and pretty. But you're down in this railway cutting, and you fail to see that actually if you just step over the railway cutting, you can see that you don't have to go through the tunnel at all. It's already nice and pretty. And that's what all these arguments do. They present you into a view where you are kind of tunnel visioned into seeing that's the only path to go. And they don't let you actually get out there and go up on top of the cutting and actually see where you can actually step.
Absolutely. And even worse than that, the follow-on argument is we have already invested this much, so we need to progress. If it doesn't work, you cut it and you move on. That's what the trader does. It's not like, oh, I've already lost so much money on this trade, eventually it has to work. No, it didn't work. Let's stop doing this and move on to something that actually works. But the rail track approach is exactly how we're thinking about these things. It narrows our vision.
Sorry to keep you interrupting.
No, you go.
It's exciting. You're excited.
I am excited. I'm also aggravated and so on. Yeah. And I think the point is this goes back to the comment between the tax and the contribution.
Yes.
When you end up giving your money to tax, for all the comments about the need to tax the wealthy and so on, it goes into projects like this, because the governments are influenced by the lobbyists who elect and the powers who money that elects them. I looked up in open secrets the amount of money that was spent in the 2024 cycle of the US election. It was something like, I forgot the exact number, it's something like 2.4 trillion for Republicans and 1.9 trillion for Democrats. That's trillion. That's trillion.
So that's like 500 billion a year on average for the cycle.
And just think about that. That's more. That's pretty much. That's more than the GDP of the United Kingdom for one cycle of election.
Yeah, the money could be used in a better way.
You can give your money and spend your money in better places.
So that's what you mean by the contribution side, right?
Yes. So it comes down to who you want to spend your money with to make the world better.
All right, so let's go back to what we started with. Is Trump irrelevant? So there's another side to the Trump story that I've been trying to make sense of what's been going on, and one of the things that they talk about is the butterfly revolution, and I think I've shared it with you, just one brief sort of example of it, and there's another thing, a website called Don't Look Up, and it talks about what's happening from an environment perspective so far, but I've got a tickle in my throat, so I'll just mute if I start coughing. But the butterfly revolution, right? So this is the what I call the South African cabal. So we all know obviously Elon Musk, but Peter Thiel, Brian Armstrong, Ben Horowitz, Mark Andreessen, and it's a whole bunch of them. And the butterfly revolution is led by this guy called Curtis Yarvin. There's a book with the same title, and they call him Lord Yarvin. If you've actually listened to him, I met a lot of people like this when I worked in the tech industry. I won't say because I'm a kind person, but anyway, the points are: campaign on autocracy, purge. Purge. I've deleted the word. Ignore the courts, co-opt Congress, centralize police and government power, shut down elite media and academic institutions, turn out your people. So the January 6th, right? And so basically the idea is these guys. There's a place called Praxis. It doesn't exist yet. They think, some people believe that's why they want Greenland, so they can build this mega city, which will be for this, they call them the Nerd Reich. I know, the Nerd Reich, sorry, where they can go and build Praxis and you can be invited into it. You can already be a member online. And the idea is they build these lots of little sort of fiefdoms all around the world. We're sort of going back to a monarchy because democracy doesn't work. That's the sort of very quickly the central premise. And I've been listening to a lot of different people talking about this. There's one guy, Duran, something, I can't remember his first name, Duran, who was the journalist that sort of has been talking about it for a long time. And now he's getting the stage because people are saying, help us understand this, right? But when and so one of the things that this guy Yarvin said is the poor people can be the biofuel. And then he went, joking, but the message is obviously, they don't care about the poor and that they're just going to focus on these sort of mini fiefdoms, right? And so I keep thinking about it, right? So these are the richest people in the world, the big tech billionaires, tech bros. So they're going to go and build their cities and you may or may not be invited to join them. So if you're not invited, what happens to you? And then how can they continue to make wealth if basically they're going to get rid of their customer or make their customers so destitute that there's no future for them? And their personal wealth at the moment, which most people think they've got money, they haven't. It's tied up in things like stocks and share prices. That's not going to be around anymore in the future. So I don't know if either of you looked into it, but it's the next bit that people are talking about what they're planning to do. Now they're saying they're doing it, and it's very obvious with a lot of the decisions that are being made. But it's the next bit that I'm not getting any answers for. How does that make sense? Have you looked at any of it or have any thoughts?
Well, I think it doesn't, and that's all part of this thing about the world running out of money. So you take, incidentally, as you're talking, it reminded me of the film Matrix.
Yeah. The Matrix is in the story as well. Yeah.
And the essence of the film Matrix is that the technology has given the illusion to people, and people are simply batteries to run the technology. And that essentially is a similar sort of description of what's going on. in that way. So we have our media, our social media, and our kind of, all our news feeds and everything is tuned and kind of, you need to make real personal searches to try and get out of what they feed you. It's really hard in that way. And the problem is actually all of these is, I don't think any of these thinks through what really happens down the road in that way. AI may be great, but you still need someone to pay. And so the productivity relies on someone to pay. And what that means is the economy eventually collapses, because the proposition of the economy is that you can make money. But that's only valuable if you can make money more than what you need to pay. So our costs going up will actually bring that into real head. That's how governments are running out of money. That's how people are feeling that tight in everything that they do. And the debt ultimately actually do matter in all of these things, because the debt finances a lot of these developments and everything else. And bankruptcy happens not because you are poor. Bankruptcy happens because you got too much debt. You can be very rich, have loads of assets, but you still go bankrupt.
Yeah.
So what you're asking for, what happens next, is actually that in the world where these things are built for, is a world where nature is an infinite pool of resources. So you can always draw on that, and that will finance it, and it'll go on through. In today's world, climate change is making that far from being an infinite pool of resources into a shrinking pool of accessible resources, and more costly in that way. So be careful where you put your money. Be careful where you want to build your high tower.
But when you think of what these guys are saying, even though they're not saying it directly, because I'm trying to interpret what they're saying based on what it really means from an environment perspective. So if a whole bunch of these little fiefdoms are built and they sort of set them up so that you can grow food and they're fairly independent. So I describe it as Mad Max but posh, right? Because they've got the infrastructure, they've got the cities, they've got the fuel to keep going, right? So, although I do think they've got their timing wrong. I think things are moving a lot faster from an environmental escalation perspective, so they better get moving if they want to build these cities. But and also, would you go to Greenland if AMOC collapses, right?
Well, NEOM is being built.
Yeah, no, well, kind of. Well, kind of. And is it being built? Because there's a lot of financial struggles with it. It is and it isn't. That's what
the question you're asking is, will it complete? And
but
it won't complete. But they are bringing their laborers and digging their thing.
And a lot of people are dying. Yeah.
Yes.
But in the Middle East, right? Is that a good place for a city based on future weather sort of predictions? Which it could be. It could be. There's a lot more water, a lot more precipitation that's landing in the Middle East now than, so it potentially could be. It could be one of those safe havens. That's the point. Do we know?
No.
But Greenland, if the AMOC goes, it's going to be sort of beyond freezing. So are they going to build a city for that? Or, like Australia in the last week, so they're about to be hit with this terrible cyclone. It's going to be 330-kilometre winds. A lot of Aboriginal communities are up in that area, and they're meeting at the moment for these annual sort of meetings. So it's a lot of people at risk, but hopefully the word's getting out. But the temperature's past 50 degrees Celsius in this part of the world.
Yeah,
we're only a couple of degrees. Not warming, actual physical temperatures of it being too hot to live, and that whole area will have to be evacuated. So when we talk about what we need to do, what the individual needs to do, my first thing is always everyone should know the risk based on where they are. If you live in a floodplain and you own a property, and there's 7% more precipitation in the environment in the air because of warming, and there's going to be more, then it's probably a good idea to get out of a floodplain. But not just the floodplain, just outside of the floodplain, areas that have never been flooded before. So as extremes start to accelerate, the place where those extremes are going to hit is going to accelerate too, right?
Yeah, and what it all leads to at
Absolutely.
the end.
I think absolutely.
This is what the costs do to you. You know, it's not free to move. It's not costless. And the costs keep piling up. And, you know, if we boil down to what we've been doing is we're trying to outrun those costs. And it's just not going to work. Nothing that I see around me, and, you know, in the economic financial world tells me that we will be able to outrun the costs. The contrary. If anything, they are accelerating a lot faster than we are running. So it's not going to end well.
From an economics perspective, does it start with insurance? Is that where that economic impact starts?
Well,
no? Okay.
It starts from the failure to be insured.
Yes.
So so it does start with insurance, but it's not in the insurance industry. The insurance industry is going to make lots of money from areas where our regulations require people to buy insurance.
Yeah.
You have to buy car insurance. That car insurance premium will keep going up in order to fuel the industry because he can't make money from his normal risk anymore.
Yeah.
You take a mortgage, you have to buy a house insurance.
Yeah. So it will be the lenders where we'll start to see the collapse financially.
So you're going to find that you're going to end up with a lenders strike. People lend because they see the world as better in the future. So when lenders strike, it's not because the person isn't qualified to borrow, it's that they don't think the world is better in the future.
Yeah, that really is the key.
So you're going to see that along. So you're going to see credit spreads widening. You're going to see those sort of things. But the tipping over is actually out of the individuals. It's because people can't make ends meet. So more people drop out of the economy. And the economy can't function with that sort of thing. The US participation rate falling down is a problem in those.
So if we all took individual action and reduced our consumption, so I think we need to, if you're in a relatively well-off position, middle class, which isn't, I think it's $10 a day. It's not that affluent, you know, by many of our standards. If we all massively reduced our energy and material consumption by 70%, and we got, you know, there's 3.8 billion middle class people in the world, right? If every single person did that, imagine that would have a massive economic fallout. But it's actually what we need to do too. So we either do it or I always say we decide or nature decides, but one way or another, it's the decision's going to be made, right?
Well, the choice is not to cut your consumption and do nothing, because then you're left with cash around, and that cash left around is going to end up filtering back through in some ways, and it's just going to end up kind of like creating more liquidity and driving things in ways you hadn't anticipated.
Okay.
It's more of actually thinking, who do I spend my money with?
Yeah.
And it's more of actually thinking about what do I need my money for? You know, is it today? Is it tomorrow? Is it the week after? And anticipating those things. And so if I think it is the week after, what are those things I want it for there? If it is not there, then that gives you a guide of thinking, where do I want to spend my money today so that it may be there that week after? And that's kind of that turns it into this longer life cycle spending, life cycle of the money itself.
I think that's a really good point. You know, I was looking at Target, right? So Target's lost a massive amount of money because it's cancelled its DEI initiatives. However, Target also does an incredible amount for communities like Black communities, right? So a lot of the products that they sell. So if you stop spending at Target, you also stop supporting minority businesses. So I think that so rather than buying 100 pieces of crappy clothes from Shein or Temu, buy one or two from a local shop
Yeah.
It's going to be a lot more expensive, but that will last, and reduce your consumption that way. I mean, just clothes, right?
Yes.
Australians are the highest consumers of clothing in the world per person. America's number 2, right? We should be buying 3 to 5 items of clothing a year. So
China is 20% of air freight.
Yeah.
Of all air freight globally.
Yeah.
You think about that?
Yeah.
That's phenomenal.
It is.
It's phenomenal.
And, it does pose these questions. It's something, David and I've talked a lot about, and we kind of boiled it down to the businesses that will do well in tomorrow's world will be those who produce genuinely needed goods and services.
Yeah.
Because the vast majority of businesses, as I see them, would either fail completely or be severely impaired and downsized because they actually don't fulfill that criteria. And that process will be painful, right?
Yeah, I call it there's bullshit industries.
Yeah, you're harsher than I am.
Yeah, but if we got rid of them, it wouldn't really take anything away from us.
No,
and
I
think anything fast, people might not enjoy losing their access to fast food, but the world would be better off without it.
Yeah, and what's going to drive this evolution towards genuinely needed goods and services will be the cost pressures. When you have interest rates at 0, money is essentially free, and you don't think of what the cost is, how you spend your money. When interest rates are higher, and that's why people, in political positions are desperate for the central banks to cut, because they like free money. It increases the maneuverability of governments, and you increase the ability to sell a monetary illusion to people. But when it's not free, and I cannot see how we can get down to those levels with inflation where it is and where it will be, that choice on how you spend your money will become much starker. And it will favor not the bullshit industries, but those that actually provide genuinely needed goods and services. But again, it becomes the individual choice. How would you like to spend your dollar?
And by the way, coming back to connecting this with the comment you made about the the massive storm hitting Australia, it's hitting sort of the Pilbara region, which is the major iron ore mining region, and it's closing the ports and disrupting that. So what people don't recognize is when they read the news of those storms, iron is used into making steel, is used into making all kinds of things that you have around the house. So next time you need something repaired, that price goes up because of that storm. And that's the economic transmission of what climate change does. That's how it impacts the economy along. So it's not just sort of thinking about the insurance of the house that's burned. It's the fact that because of the lack of revenue, because the house is burned and they're not going to give the insurance to that house anymore, your car insurance goes up because the industry still wants to make its profit in that way.
Yeah. And David, it's one of the things you've talked about before, because I've been noticing a lot more. So obviously Queensland has been getting absolutely hammered by floods, but Melbourne faced this really significant storm a couple of weeks ago, right when it was going through a heat wave. So this storm comes through overnight, wipes out the electricity, and then thousands and thousands of people are left without electricity while they're also dealing with the heat wave. And it's that step, right? And so for me, the iron ore story was also just as Trump's bringing in this global sort of tariffs, right, on steel, the largest shipping port could be like severely damaged, which is going to increase the cost of steel as well around the world. So, it's this happens and this happens and this happens and this happens. And I think people are still looking at things in isolation. In California right now, they've got an atmospheric river going through. It could potentially cause catastrophic floods. The amount of plastics that are in people's homes, they basically, that whole area that was burned, they're saying, there's no way you could grow food there because it's so polluted now with these burning chemicals, not just in the air, but also in the land. So it's the roll-on effects. And I think that's the thing that we're starting to see more and more.
Yeah. And it goes back down to the comment we all started with, I think, apart from the Valentine's Day greeting, it is about your own preparedness. You can think of that as yourself or your business or your community in that sense, or your local government, and in that sense, the national government in that way. We don't think of climate change as in terms of like people in Japan think about earthquakes, which is about a preparedness. It is inevitable. At some point, it's going to happen. Do we know where we need to go to? Do we have our boat go back? Where are our things? If you sat down and you sat down with a group of people and you basically say, okay, fine. What was your lesson from the Palisades? I'll tell you mine. My lesson from the Palisades was that picture on the beachfront that was burnt, of that property on the beachfront that was burnt. And I bet you that person never thought that wildfire was going to be their problem. Flooding, maybe, tsunami, whatever else. Wildfire, come on, I've got water all over me.
Yeah.
And so in terms of that preparedness is not about preparing for what you think may come. It's about preparing for what you feel you will need. I want pictures of my kids. So where are my copies of them?
Yeah, let's finish with that. Let's finish with preparedness.
No.
Yeah.
All right, David, do you want to keep going? So, photos of your kids, and would you suggest physical as well as digital?
Absolutely. So I want to be able to have them on somewhere digital in that way. I like physical things too. So physical things, it comes into this part where who do I want to share it with who would also value it? So my kids are now grown and they grow and live in different places. So they are the obvious people I want to share some of these things with, rather than waiting until I die for them to get it.
Yeah.
In that way, because it may come that actually, I may have to camp out at wherever they are. The one that bets it. That may be what it is. And then there's the financial. Who do I actually trust to place my money? Where do I want that to be? It's really back down to 2008 when it was about the return of money, when that money market fund broke the dollar. That never happened. By the way, that means that you put your money in something which is supposed to earn interest like in a bank. And the next thing you check on it is that you've actually got less than what you had before. So that was breaking the dollar. You put $1 in, supposed to give you $1 and a penny. You come back and you found that it's only 98 cents or even 80 cents. That had never happened before in that way. So where do you put it so that even if it were to break the dollar, you still have something along? When crisis comes, everything collapses and goes crazy. So where do you have what you need? It's not going to be about where 90% of my wealth, how do I protect that? It's actually going to be about where do I have the 10% that actually lets me carry on and manage? What are the skills that I have? I talked to a friend yesterday. I met, and we're talking about a friend of mine who ran sort of the digital media for this company, and does sort of coding and stuff. And he does gardening work for people. And he says, it's just skills. So what are skills? What are your skills? What's the skills of your company? Who has what? Because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know which skill is going to be the relevant skill. But the point about all of this is it gives you confidence in yourself. And that's the most important part. Because it gives you the sense.
I totally agree. I totally agree with being able to grow stuff. That's something I'm, I was standing in Phuket when the pandemic lockdown happened, and I remember standing on my balcony going, how am I going to feed the family? I didn't know at that point. Of course, we worked it out and all that sort of stuff, but it was that real feeling of I have no control over the food. So it was such a moment of clarity for me. A lot of people jumped on planes and got out of the country before it locked down, but we decided to stay. We worked it out. But ever since, growing food's been a priority, and we've got all sorts of stuff growing in our garden here in Singapore, in the city. Composting, we do bokashi. There's we do all sorts of stuff. and it's important. I'd like to add. So we've got the suitcase, the little suitcase that's got all of the important documents, as well as bits of jewelry that neither of us really care about, but potentially could pay a bribe to get over a border to get somewhere if our children need it at some point. So that's the sort of thinking that we're doing. Generally, we should be okay. We've got the right to live in 4 countries on the planet, so we're already lucky there. But one of the things I think people really need to start thinking about is not just because, I was talking about the nerd Reich, right, and what they're doing, and some of the conversation around cloud and the prevalence of the importance of cloud is very much worth listening to. God, the name's just gone in my head, but there's a lot of people talking about it, and I think we need to free ourselves up a little bit more from the digital space. We need to create a little bit more distance. I think we're people. In the US, any woman who uses a period tracker, I just don't understand why you would do that. Just don't. One of the investors in that technology is one of these guys that's in the South African cabal. That sort of personal information, I don't understand why people put it in. We give too much away, and we've been doing it for a really, really long time, and it's always baffled me. But if there's a time, if you're in a place where it's moving towards the authoritarian bent, they've got a lot of information on you. So I would suggest that it's a good time to really start looking at your digital presence, and maybe reducing what you share, even though the history's there. But yeah.
Absolutely.
Richard?
No, I like the idea with being both physical and digital. Of course, there's some stuff, on a USB, but there are also a lot of physical assets. And I have a rucksack packed, contains water bottles, change of clothing, and pack of pasta, and some jewelry. And I think, being a financial nerd and all that, and I think that's one of the reasons you see gold prices keep on going up, is actually that people now are sensing the need of something physical in a physical world. We can't separate ourselves from. David always likes to say the vast majority of people think the safest place to be is in the cloud. I've never been one of those, right? But I appreciate the argument. And I think what you're seeing is more and more saying, I'm happy in the cloud, but you know what? I'm going to put something into the physical world, because there will come a point in time where you will not necessarily have to use it, but you will have to think about using it. And that's the kind of, we can't separate ourselves from the physical reality. And, everything that's really dear to you, mementos like photographs and things, don't store them all in the same place, because if that happens, then they're all gone. You lose some of them, fair enough, don't lose them all.
I'd like to add a little bit more to this metaphorical go back, or it's not metaphorical, this sort of hypothetical go back is where you go to.
Yeah.
And there is a case of, your friends and family network, basically.
Mm.
The situation will come that someone will need some place to stay, and that may be you, or it may be someone else.
Yeah.
It may be a couch, it may be whatever it is, you can't tell, however it is. And knowing that you may be able to have a place to go to no matter what is part of having that confidence to be able to face what there is. It tells you you're not alone.
Mm.
And that's what Trump is trying to do. That's why he's irrelevant. He's trying to make everybody feel they are alone if they're not with him. The reality is you're not alone because you're not with him. If you are with him, then you make yourself alone, because no one else can trust you or him or anyone.
Yeah.
And so you have to actually go along and say, the possessions that actually helps me in my identity, in my health, the possessions that allows me to travel one place to the next or whatever, the possession that helps me to go from one point to another, and also the things which are not possessions, which is my connections, my friends and family network, the parts that ends up sharing with each other as we talk through. So those are the sort of things I need, and of course a good book.
Yeah.
No, I think that the whole community focus is so important. If you're one of those people that's disassociated from your community, I've got community all over the world, right? Because I've been sort of moving, but I think the people I grew up with who are still in the area where we grew up, their community is much stronger than mine, and I think that's a real benefit. So yeah, community is a really important one. But the other thing to think about, so first of all, go and check out what the preppers are writing. They're fascinating. They're such a fascinating community of people, and I've been checking them out for a long time. I think being in Singapore, this is such a well prepared place. In Thailand, we were suffering big time with the supply chain shortages. Every time I asked people here, there was none. But emergency medical. So, like if you're going to go through a crisis, what sort of time frame based on the risks where you are will it be before you can get sort of back on your feet? So therefore, glasses, contact lenses, medication, go to the dentist. Seriously, go to the dentist, get your teeth fixed. Don't mess around with stuff like that. But get yourself prepared in, give yourself a 3-month window. Or a 12-month window, depending on where you are, because if you're in a much poorer part of the world, you might need a little bit longer. So I think that's another thing that people can do.
Yeah,
Richard, you got any more?
No, just the general sense that you need to think a little bit further than saying everything will always be available at my fingertip whenever I want it. That's just not the world we're heading into. And then it's up to each and every one of you to figure out whether you want an extra pack of rice in the cupboard, or do I need to stock up on more paracetamols, or whatever I think is that I will be needing to get me through a couple of days where, there might not be any stores open. How am I going to feed myself?
Cash. I saw
Cash
that in in the Appalachian, in the North Carolina area. The one thing they didn't have was cash.
Yeah,
because everything's digital.
And that frightens me. It really does, because I've never been a person who has that kind of trust in the cloud, in the digital world. Yeah, I'm far too much of an analog person. Doesn't mean I don't embrace technology, but there are certain things you want to keep analog. And one of them is cash, and the other one is probably gold. It's a good idea to have something physical and tangible to trade yourself out of a tricky situation. And let's not talk about guns. So,
no, but know how to use one.
It's just, I think the so much of these things can apply very much in terms of a bigger organization. As much as when we talk about it, sounds like it's personal, but actually the same thing applies whether you are kind of like a local authority organization, or whether you are kind of a small to medium to even a large business in that way. The worst thing is to believe that somehow you're prepared. And
so Apple's supply chain, right? They worked out that there was so much vulnerability, and it's factories sort of in the Asia Pacific, sort of in that sort of strip around the world in Africa. There's all these factories where there's no air conditioning, so it's too hot to work. Once it gets hotter, people are going to die just from that. Extreme floods hitting these areas, being able to get the products moving. There was so many risks within the supply chain from weather. And every business needs to be looking at that, but every individual needs to look at what is my risk based on where I am. And it's not a pretty thing, right, to face, but I can't believe that people aren't thinking about it.
Well, back to the thinking has to start from some sense of an identity. Basically, I've been using the word thrive a lot, And that's sort of, who am I? What am I? How do I thrive? What do I need to thrive? What does thriving mean? And that's really interesting, because there was a paper written by Theodore Levitt back in 1960 in Harvard Business Review called "Marketing Myopia," and I talk a lot about it. And it talks about companies who, in some sense, lose sight of who they are. They think they are the technology, and so they improve the technology, but they forget they are who the customer sees them as in that way, because at the end of the day, the company exists because it provides goods that customers want. And that connection is something that we can easily lose sight of. So when we prepare, we can easily lose sight of actually what is it that makes me thrive. We think of the individual items, but sometimes this is a woman in an interview in California last month, when the fires had gone on there, and she comes from the Ukraine. She arrived a few months earlier, and she'd gone out in the morning to work and come back, and everything is burnt. And she says, "Well, I just have to start again."
Because she knows what that's like, right? Yeah.
She can say that because she has that sense of who she is, and that identity along, and she doesn't have any other things and so on. And that's really important, because you can become too prepared in the material aspects and not at all prepared in that sort of mental and aspect of understanding that there is a place for you. It doesn't actually need to be in the world in terms of material items.
Yeah. I totally. The mental preparedness is probably the most important thing. Is Gustav also in the finance sector?
Yes, he's been in. Actually, Richard met him 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
30 years ago, more than 30 years ago.
40 years ago.
Yeah.
A personal risk pie chart. I like it. All right, so we probably should wrap up. But there's a lot going on. It's the time of the year where we hear a lot from Antarctica, because the scientists are really wrapping up what they're doing there right now. And there's some pretty, I don't know if you saw that there's a massive methane leak now that's been identified in Antarctica. I think there was a Spanish scientific team. So there's a lot going on there. We saw Hansen and his team release a report saying 2 degrees Celsius warming is dead. That's creating a lot of really interesting conversation with the scientists. Bali's just been hammered by extreme weather. Obviously, Greenland's still melting. Brazil, they've had to close schools because it's southern hemisphere, so it's summertime. But it just got so hot the kids couldn't go to school. But an interesting one, I think it was in Monga Bay, Brazil has seen a 460% increase in climate-related disasters since the 1990s. It's extraordinary what's going on there. Lots going on. I was talking about the 50 degrees Celsius temperatures in Australia on the west coast, but the scientists are warning of a threat to chocolate. So initially, people won't really be concerned as long as you can afford to buy it, but eventually that's going to be one. But the final piece of news, there's lots going on, is air pollution. So we had Weena on a little while ago. So in the UK, there's 1,100 cases a year of lung cancer that's not in non-smokers. Thailand, 10 million people sought treatment for pollution-related illnesses, and they've just had another massive pollution. And then lung cancer diagnoses are on the rise for never smokers right across the world. So pollution, plastic pollution, chemical pollutions, forever chemicals, all that sort of stuff. When I was trying to find out the impacts like 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was really hard to find anything. Now there's a lot more information becoming available. So it's not just climate change, right? That's what a lot of people talk about. It's all of these different things.
Well, I think of it as, a lot of it is oil, gas, and coal, and the products that they can produce and the way we use it. And what isn't directly there is that the energy that's provided and what they do. And ultimately, it comes down to the fact that even if you replace the energy, it's what you do with your energy. So
Yeah.
it does come down to sort of waking up in the morning, thinking about what you do, whether you're a person or a business or community, and actually thinking through and saying, what of that is genuinely me that I actually need to do?
Yeah. I like that. All right, so we're going to be back in a couple of weeks, and we are going to have
Indeed.
some special guests where we're going to talk about the marketing industry. which
Exciting.
will-
Yes.
yeah. That's more my territory than your territory, but
Yeah.
it'll be really interesting to talk about it and just get that perspective and the role. And my background's all PR, content marketing, so I'm really looking forward to introducing our very special guests then. So, in the meantime, thanks guys. Good to catch up. Lots going on, and
Thank you very much.
Indeed. Thank
see you in a
you.
couple of weeks.
Restart.
All right.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Oh yeah, happy
Indeed.
Valentine's Day.
Yeah. See you in a
Bye.
couple of